the heel grasper and the God who chose him. Before Jacob ever opened his eyes, before he ever took his first breath, before he ever deceived or bargained or ran, his story was already trembling with tension. Even in the hidden darkness of his mother's womb, something ancient began to stir. Two brothers wrestled in a place too small to contain the future that burned inside them, Esau and Jacob, struggling against each other before either had a name. Their mother felt it, a turmoil more than natural, and when she cried out to God, she received a prophecy that would shape history. Two nations are in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger. This was the beginning of Jacob's paradox, a calling announced before character, a destiny spoken before morality, a divine choice before a single human decision. Jacob did not enter the world quietly. He emerged with his tiny hand wrapped around Esau's heel, as if refusing to be second, as if grasping for something he could not yet name. That single image, an infant gripping his brother, became the first symbol of his life. His story would be marked by grasping, reaching, taking, pulling toward himself what he believed should be his. Jacob arrived in the world hungry for blessing before he even knew what blessing was. And yet, woven into that hunger was the whisper of divine election. God had chosen the younger over the older. God had declared a reversal of human expectations. God had set his sight on Jacob, not because Jacob would behave better, but because through Jacob, broken, grasping, complicated Jacob, God would reveal something about grace. Jacob grew up in a world still fresh after the flood of Eden's loss, a world of wandering nomads, tents that fluttered in desert winds, flocks bleating under the watchful eye of shepherds, and campfires glowing beneath a sky heavy with stars. His father Isaac carried the memory of near sacrifice. His grandfather Abraham was the man who left everything behind to follow the voice of heaven. Jacob inherited their world, their tents, their land, their promises, but he did not inherit their spiritual clarity. While Abraham and Isaac walked with God in dramatic encounters, Jacob grew up in the shadow of those stories, perhaps wondering whether any of that divine nearness would ever reach him. He was not Esau. Esau filled the camp with the scent of the open fields, with the adrenaline of the hunt, with the sound of triumph when arrows struck true. Esau was wild, free, beloved by Isaac, the son who brought back game and laid it proudly before his father. Jacob, in contrast, stayed among the tents. He moved quietly, observed carefully, thought deeply. He learned how to listen, how to adapt, how to see opportunities others missed. He learned how to survive with intellect instead of strength. But alongside these gifts, he learned something darker: how to scheme, how to manipulate, how to twist a moment toward his advantage. Yet beneath this cunning lay a longing more ancient than his flaws. Jacob wanted blessing, not just material wealth or approval, but the deeper blessing tied to God's promises. He wanted what Abraham had. He wanted what Isaac inherited. He wanted the spiritual inheritance that shaped nations. It was a holy desire entangled with unholy methods. And this mixture, this collision of desire and deceit, became the axis on which his entire life turned. From the very beginning, Jacob lived inside a paradox. His actions made him seem unworthy, yet his destiny declared him chosen. He grasped for blessings God had already promised. He tried to achieve through deception what heaven had prepared through election. He ran after what God wanted to give, but in the wrong direction, with the wrong tools, through the wrong heart. The result was a man constantly at war within himself. A man meant for greatness, but shaped by insecurity. A man chosen for a holy inheritance, but driven by fear that he might never receive it. The same hands that would one day bless 12 sons, the foundation of Israel, were first the hands that clung to a heel, desperate not to fall behind. Even from the outside, Jacob's life seems like a contradiction. The patriarch of Israel begins as a deceiver. The father of tribes begins as a fugitive. The bearer of covenant begins by grasping what was never his to take. But the paradox becomes sharper when viewed through heaven's eyes. The God who condemns deception is the same God who chooses the deceiver. The God who opposes pride is the same God who raises Jacob's name above Esau's. The God who could have chosen the strong instead chooses the weak, the one who manipulates instead of the one who hunts. This is the mystery we must carry into Jacob's story. He is not good enough to deserve God's favor, but he is hungry enough to pursue it. And something in that hunger seems to matter more to God than the flawless obedience of others. Jacob is a mirror of the human heart, wanting the things of God, but reaching for them with trembling, imperfect hands. His flaw is obvious, his longing is undeniable. And somehow, in the tension between the two, God begins to write a story that will shape the destiny of a nation. He is born grasping, but he is not abandoned. He deceives, but he is not disqualified. He runs, but he is not forgotten. He sins, but he is not cast away. From the womb, Jacob was chosen. From the beginning, he was loved. From the start, he was marked not by his grasping, but by the God who intended to rename him. And this raises the central question that will guide the entire journey ahead. How does a man who spends his life taking become the one to whom God freely gives? How does a deceiver become Israel? That is the mystery, and that is where our story begins. The hunger for blessing. Jacob grew up in a household divided by affection. Isaac's love bent instinctively toward Esau, the rugged hunter who filled the tents with the scent of the wild and the triumph of the chase. Esau was everything a patriarch might admire. Bold, physical, fearless, impulsive, a man who lived by strength and instinct. Isaac saw in him something of Abraham's courage, a man unafraid of the unknown. But Rebekah's heart turned toward Jacob. She saw his quiet mind, his thoughtful eyes, the way he lingered near the tents, absorbing the rhythms of family life. She saw the depth beneath his stillness, the spark behind his questions, the hunger behind his reserved demeanor. Between these two sons, the household was a balance of noise and silence. Esau burst through the camp with the smell of sweat and the dust of the hunt in his hair. Jacob moved through the same spaces like a shadow, not unnoticed but uncelebrated, present but easily overshadowed. Esau commanded attention. Jacob invited it. Esau conquered the world outside. Jacob navigated the world inside. But beneath Jacob's quietness lay a desire that grew as surely as the crops he helped tend, the desire for blessing. Not the blessing of material wealth or the admiration of others, but the deep blessing that shaped the destiny of his family, the blessing that had come from Abraham to Isaac, the blessing God himself had breathed into their lineage. Jacob didn't just want prosperity, he wanted purpose. He didn't just want approval, he wanted identity. He longed to take his place in a story older than he was, to receive the inheritance that carried spiritual weight, the promise of land, lineage, and divine favor. The problem was that Jacob was the younger brother. By all cultural logic, the birthright and the blessing belonged to Esau. But Jacob had heard the prophecy. He had felt his mother's quiet conviction that God had different plans. Even so, prophecy alone was not enough to ease the restlessness in Jacob's heart. He carried a sense of being overlooked, a sense that what was promised might still slip through his fingers if he didn't reach for it himself. It was this internal tension, this mix of destiny and insecurity, that prepared Jacob for the moment that revealed both his desire and his flaw. One day, Esau came home, exhausted from the hunt, drained to the point of collapse. Jacob was cooking a pot of red stew, the aroma rising into the air like an invitation. Esau demanded food, almost as if nothing else mattered. Jacob, seeing his brother's desperation, saw an opportunity. "Sell me your birthright," he said. Esau scoffed, impatient. "What good is a birthright to me? I am about to die." So Esau swore an oath, giving up his birthright in exchange for a bowl of stew. It was a troubling exchange, not simply because Jacob took advantage of the moment, but because Esau treated the sacred as disposable. Jacob's hunger for spiritual inheritance, however flawed, was deeper than Esau's appreciation of it. This was the first glimpse of a truth that would follow Jacob all his life. He desired the things of God more intensely than the brother who technically owned them. But desire alone does not sanctify our methods, and Jacob's impulse to grasp prematurely opened the door to a larger deception. Years passed, and Isaac grew old. His eyesight dimmed until the world melted into shadows. Knowing his time was short, he called Esau to him. He wanted to give his eldest son the blessing of the firstborn, final words that would echo into generations. It was a moment charged with tradition, significance, and sacred weight. Esau set out to hunt game and prepare a meal for his father, unaware that Rebekah had been listening. She hurried to Jacob not with suggestion, but with a plan. She believed the prophecy. She believed God had chosen Jacob. But instead of trusting God to accomplish his word, she sought to create the fulfillment herself. Jacob hesitated. What if he touches me? My brother is hairy, and I am smooth. His concern wasn't moral, it was practical. He feared being caught, not being deceitful. Rebekah reassured him, covering Jacob's arms and neck with goatskins, dressing him in Esau's clothes, preparing the meal Isaac loved. Then Jacob stood at the entrance of his father's tent, a man about to enter the defining act of his early life. He stepped inside, carrying a lie wrapped in the scent of another man. Isaac's voice trembled with confusion. "Who is it, my son?" Jacob answered with the most decisive lie he would ever speak. "I am Esau." The tent became a place where destiny and deception collided. Isaac touched the goatskins. He smelled the clothes. He heard Jacob's voice but felt Esau's hands. Suspicion lingered, but the blessing flowed. Isaac declared over Jacob the dew of heaven, the richness of the earth, nations bowing, brothers serving. It was the blessing of Abraham, the blessing God had promised Jacob before he was even born. But now Jacob received it through deceit. The paradox sharpened. God allowed the blessing to stand. There was no reversal, no correction, no divine interruption. Instead, the blessing settled on Jacob, like prophecy fulfilled through human imperfection. It revealed something uncomfortable and profound. God's purposes are not undone by human weakness, nor assisted by human manipulation, yet he weaves both weakness and manipulation into the tapestry of his will. But Jacob's deception came with immediate consequences. No sooner had he left the tent than Esau returned. When the truth was revealed, Esau's cry tore through the camp like an animal wounded in its soul. His anguish turned quickly to murderous rage. He vowed to kill Jacob the moment Isaac died. Jacob, who had grabbed the heel at birth and grabbed the blessing through deceit, now had to grab his belongings and run. His mother urged him to flee to her brother Laban, away from Esau's fury. For the first time in his life, Jacob became a fugitive. The blessing he had taken now drove him away from everything familiar. He journeyed alone into the wilderness, a man with no companion, no home, and a future uncertain. When night fell, Jacob lay down with a stone for a pillow. The stars above him were the same stars God had shown Abraham, the same stars representing descendants too numerous to count. But Jacob did not feel chosen. He felt hunted. He did not feel blessed. He felt exposed. He did not feel destined. He felt afraid. Then came the dream. A ladder stretched from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending, a vision of a world where heaven is not distant, where God moves freely between realms, where divine purpose descends into human story. And at the top stood the Lord, speaking directly into Jacob's fear. "I am the God of Abraham and Isaac. The land where you lie, I will give to you. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. I am with you and will not leave you." In one night, Jacob learned a truth that would follow him forever. God had not chosen him because he behaved well. God had chosen him because God keeps his own promises. Jacob woke trembling. He had deceived. He had run. He had manipulated every moment of his story so far. But now he realized something both comforting and terrifying. He was not running ahead of God. He was running into him. This marked the peak of Jacob's rise, not the moment he obtained the blessing through deception, but the moment God affirmed that the blessing was his from the beginning, not because of the lie, but in spite of it. Jacob had sought blessing with frantic hands. Now he had seen the God who gives it freely, and his journey, complicated, painful, divine, was only beginning. The stranger at the river. Jacob had spent 20 years running from Esau's wrath, running into Laban's schemes, running through bargains and deals and midnight escapes. Every step of his life seemed to carry the echo of his earliest moment. A hand grasping, always pulling toward a blessing he feared might be snatched away if he didn't fight for it. He had built wealth, amassed flocks, taken wives, fathered children, outwitted Laban, and carved out a life. But no success had silenced the old fear. No gain had calmed his restless heart, because one shadow still stretched across his path. Esau. When the time came to return home, Jacob gathered his many flocks, servants, and family, and began the long journey back toward the land he had fled as a young deceiver. The closer he came to Canaan, the more his confidence drained. He sent messengers ahead to inform Esau of his arrival, hoping to soften the weight of 20 years. When they returned, their words struck like thunder. "Esau is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." Jacob's breath caught. 400 men was not a welcome party. It was an army. His past had finally caught up with him. The blessing he had stolen was now demanding its reckoning. Every deception, every moment of selfish grasping, every fear he had fled, all stood before him in the form of his brother riding toward him with overwhelming force. His mind spun. He divided the people with him into two camps, calculating how to preserve whatever could survive. The old Jacob, the planner, the schemer, the strategist, rose again. He arranged gifts for Esau, livestock in waves, a choreography of appeasement. He rehearsed speeches. He prayed with trembling sincerity, invoking the God of his fathers. But beneath every prayer was panic. Beneath every plan was fear. Beneath every step was the dread of a man returning not just to a brother, but to a verdict. When night fell, Jacob sent his wives, his children, and all he possessed across the Jabbok River. He remained behind, alone. The night pressed in around him, thick and cold. The only sound was the murmur of the river, moved by moonlight. He was a man between worlds, between Laban and Esau, between past and future, between fear and faith, between the man he had been and the man he would become. And in that fragile in-between, a figure emerged. The text does not tell us when the stranger arrived. It does not say whether Jacob saw him or only felt the sudden presence. All we know is that a man seized him, and Jacob fought back. They grappled in the darkness, their silhouettes twisting against the moonlit stones, bodies straining, breath ragged, muscles shaking. No words were spoken. The fight was raw, primal, ancient. Jacob fought as though the stranger was the embodiment of every force that had ever threatened him. And the stranger did not relent. Minutes became hours. The night deepened. Jacob's limbs trembled, sweat soaked through his garments. The stranger's grip was relentless, unyielding, almost supernatural. Jacob had wrestled with Laban, with Esau, with his own guilt and fear, but this was different. This was a fight that seemed to reach beneath his skin, pulling at the very core of who he was. He was not wrestling a man. He was wrestling something more. The struggle became a mirror of every internal battle he had refused to face. He fought because he did not know how to surrender. He fought because he had always fought. He fought because grasping was all he had ever known. And then, with a single touch, everything changed. The stranger reached out and touched Jacob's hip, not with force, not with violence, but with a simple, devastating motion. Jacob's leg buckled. Pain shot through his body. His strength failed. His body collapsed into helplessness. The grasping man had been grasped by something greater than himself, but Jacob did not release him. Even broken, even limping, even unable to stand without agony, he clung to the stranger with trembling arms. His voice finally broke through the silence of the night, raw, desperate, pleading, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This was the turning point, the hinge of Jacob's entire life. The deceiver was done deceiving. The taker was done taking. The man who had always grasped now clung not in manipulation, but in surrender. In that moment, Jacob's hands held not a heel, not a blessing stolen by cunning, not a plan crafted by fear, but God himself grasped not to steal, but to be transformed. The stranger spoke. The question pierced through the darkness. "What is your name?" Jacob answered with a confession deeper than he understood. "Jacob, my name is Jacob. My name is the deceiver. My name is the grasping one. My name is the man who runs." The stranger replied with the words that would redefine history. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel." The night was ending, but the man who emerged from it would never be the same. The breaking and the blessing. The moment Jacob's hip was touched, something inside him shattered. Not just bone, not just strength, something deeper, something woven into the core of his identity. He had lived his entire life leaning on his own cleverness, his own planning, his own ability to twist circumstances in his favor. But with a single touch, all of that self-reliance collapsed. He could no longer stand in his own power. He could no longer run from danger. He could no longer maneuver himself out of whatever consequences awaited him. His body had finally told the truth. His heart had resisted. He was not strong enough to carry the blessing by his own strength. He held on, trembling. His fingers dug into the stranger's form, not with the grasping selfishness of his youth, but with the raw desperation of a man who knows he cannot survive unless God meets him. Jacob had grasped Esau's heel. He had grasped the birthright. He had grasped the blessing. But for the first time, Jacob grasped not to steal, but to surrender. His grip was no longer the hold of a manipulator. This was the grip of a man at the edge of himself, clinging to the only one who could redefine him. The stranger spoke again into the darkness. "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob, panting from pain, eyes burning with fear and longing, refused. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It was a cry torn from the deepest part of him, a cry shaped from every wound, every insecurity, every longing, every failure. Jacob had chased blessing his whole life. Now he was finally asking for it from the only one who could truly give it. Then came the question, simple, piercing, devastating. "What is your name?" For a moment, Jacob could not speak. His whole life was contained in that question. He knew what his name meant. He knew what it had cost him. He knew the wounds he had inflicted, the pain he had carried, the lies he had told, the things he had taken. He knew his name was a mirror of the man he had been. Jacob whispered the truth he had run from. Jacob. It was confession. It was surrender. It was repentance without ceremony. It was the first time he admitted aloud the identity he had always tried to hide behind cleverness and schemes. He was Jacob, the supplanter, the deceiver, the grasping one. Then the stranger answered with words that were like a sunrise breaking open the darkness. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." The name fell on him like a mantle, heavy with destiny, light with grace, shining with a future he had not earned. Israel, the one who wrestles with God, the one who holds on, the one who survives the breaking, the one whose blessing comes not through deceit, but through surrender, the one who lives not by grasping, but by clinging. Jacob had fought all night, but the real victory came in the moment he stopped pretending. The blessing he had tried to take with lies, he now received with honesty. The God he once tried to outmaneuver now gave him a new identity with divine tenderness. Jacob had been broken so he could be blessed. He had been wounded so he could walk differently for the rest of his life. As the first rays of dawn spilled across the river, the stranger departed. Jacob was left alone in the rising light, limping, aching, breathless, transformed. The limp was not a punishment. It was a mark of intimacy, a reminder that he had met God in the dark and lived. Every step he took from that morning onward would echo the memory of that encounter. The limp said, "God touched me, God broke me, God blessed me." When Jacob lifted his eyes toward the horizon, he saw Esau approaching. The figure grew larger on the plain. Esau, powerful, broad-shouldered, accompanied by 400 men. Jacob felt the old fear surge inside, but his body reminded him of his new truth. He could not run. He could only walk forward in weakness, guided by the blessing he had received. This time, Jacob did not hide behind schemes or disguises. He did not divide his family out of calculation, but out of responsibility. He put the others ahead of him, not as shields, but as treasures he longed to protect. And then he stepped forward alone. He bowed once, then again, 7 times in all. Each bow was a letting go of the lies he had told, of the pride he had held, of the superiority he once sought. Jacob the deceiver had bowed to no one. Israel, the transformed, bowed to the brother he had wronged. Esau saw him and began to run, not with spear or fury, but with tears forming along the edges of his eyes. He ran like a brother longing for reconciliation, not revenge. He ran toward the man who had betrayed him decades earlier, and instead of a blow, opened his arms. They collided in an embrace that carried the weight of 20 years. Esau wept, Jacob wept. Two sons held each other in the middle of the wilderness, and for a moment, all the hurt and history dissolved. Jacob had prepared gifts to appease Esau, entire droves of animals meant to soften his anger. But Esau wanted none of it. "I have enough, my brother," he said, offering back the affection Jacob had long feared he had lost. It was grace, pure grace. The same grace that had marked Jacob at the river now met him on the road home. Jacob insisted on giving the gifts, not as payment, but as confession. "Please accept the blessing that has been brought to you," he said, deliberately using the word blessing, the very thing he had stolen. This time, he offered it freely. Jacob's blessing no longer came from deception, it came from humility. Esau accepted, and peace settled between them. Jacob continued his journey limping, slower than before, but more whole than he had ever been. The man who had once run from Esau now walked toward the future God had prepared. The limp was no burden. It was a testimony. It said, "The God who broke me also blessed me." It said, "The God who confronted me also renamed me." It said, "I cannot walk in my old strength. I must walk in his." Jacob's life had been shaped by grasping, but now his future would be shaped by grace. He had taken the blessing from his father through deceit, but now he carried the blessing of God through brokenness. His story was no longer the story of a man trying to control his destiny. It was the story of a man surrendered to a destiny greater than his flaws. And as he stepped into the land that had been promised to Abraham and Isaac, he carried with him the greatest truth he had ever learned. Blessing comes not to the one who takes, but to the one who clings. Victory comes not through wit, but through weakness. Transformation comes not through running, but through wrestling and staying. The God who renames the deceiver. When Jacob walked away from the Jabbok River, the limp was unmistakable. Every step carried the memory of the divine touch that had broken him and the blessing that had remade him. The night behind him was not simply a moment. It was a dividing line. The man who entered the darkness was Jacob the heel-grabber, the trickster, the one who lived by cunning and escaped by cleverness. The man who stepped into the dawn was Israel, the one who had wrestled with God and survived. The one who finally understood that the blessing he had chased his entire life could not be stolen, manipulated, or forced. It could only be received. The limp would accompany him for the rest of his life. It was not a scar of shame, but a mark of intimacy. It whispered to him with every uneven step, "You met God, you clung to him. You would rather be broken in his presence than whole without him." The one who once walked quickly toward his own schemes now moved slowly, measured by grace rather than speed, by surrender rather than strategy. What Jacob discovered in that long night was the truth he had spent his whole life avoiding. He did not need to take what God had already chosen to give. The birthright, the blessing, the promise, they were never rewards earned by his cunning. They were gifts anchored in a covenant older than his failures, stronger than his flaws. The God of Abraham and Isaac had always intended to be the God of Jacob. Not because Jacob was good, but because God was faithful. This is the revelation at the heart of his story. Jacob did not change God's mind. God changed Jacob's identity. He had spent years becoming a man he was never meant to be. But in one night, God made him into the man he was always destined to become. And the most astonishing part is this: God did not wait for Jacob to be righteous before he renamed him. God met him in his struggle, in his fear, in his exhaustion, in his guilt. God blessed Jacob not because Jacob deserved blessing, but because Jacob, through all his contradictions, still reached for God. The reconciliation with Esau became the outward confirmation of the inward transformation. Jacob bowed 7 times, not because he feared death, but because he understood humility for the first time. When Esau embraced him, Jacob realized he was witnessing a miracle, one he had not schemed into existence. Grace flowed from a brother who had every right to demand justice. Mercy met him on a road he had once fled in terror. Jacob saw in Esau's face something unexpected. He saw forgiveness. He saw restoration. He saw a reflection of the God who had just blessed him. "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God," he told Esau. It was true in more ways than one. For the man who had seen God in a wrestling match now saw God again in the arms of a brother who chose reconciliation over revenge. As Jacob continued his journey, his household moved ahead of him, but Jacob lingered near the back, not with the urgency of a man running from danger, but with the calm of a man who finally understood that destiny does not require haste. The promised land stretched before him. The covenant waited to unfold, and history would soon begin calling him not by the name of his failures, but by the name God had given him: Israel. Israel would father 12 sons, and those 12 sons would become the tribes of God's chosen nation. The story of Israel, the people, begins with Israel, the man, a man who lied, who ran, who grasped, who feared, and who finally allowed God to break him so that God could bless him. This is perhaps the deepest echo of his life. Transformation is not born from perfection, but from surrender. Jacob's limp, which once felt like a weakness, became a sign of victory. It declared that God does his strongest work in those willing to be weakened. It revealed that the path to blessing is not paved with cleverness, but with clinging, not with force, but with faith, not with grasping, but with grace. And it reminds us that God still works this way. He still chooses the unexpected. He still redeems the undeserving. He still breaks what must be broken so that he can rebuild what must be restored. He still renames those who carry shame. He still touches the places we rely on most, not to destroy us, but to change the way we walk. Jacob shows us who we are and who we can become. We are all grasping for things we cannot hold. We are all trying to control what only God can give. We all have moments where we run into the night, burdened by what we've done and terrified of what awaits us. But Jacob reminds us that the God who meets us in the dark is the same God who walks beside us in the dawn. The God who wrestles us into surrender is the God who renames us into purpose. The God who wounds us is the God who blesses us. And the God who sees our deception is the God who still chooses to call us his own. Jacob's final echo is simple, profound, and unshakably human. Blessing is not achieved. Blessing is received. Identity is not taken. Identity is given. Grace does not wait for perfection. Grace transforms imperfection. Jacob, heel grasper, deceiver, fugitive, became Israel because God stepped into his struggle. And every step he took thereafter, limping but loved, testified to the truth that still shapes the story of every believer. We are not defined by the name we make for ourselves, but by the name God speaks over us.